Gibraltar's strategic location has meant that over the years it has enjoyed an importance which is out of all proportion to its size. It is a territory that has been fought over by Moor, Spaniard and Briton. It is a place that has seen many sieges, and it is the 18th century sieges that I'm going to be talking about in this series. When Gibraltar was taken in August 1704 in the name of the Archduke Charles of Austria, who proclaimed himself King Charles III of Spain, it was anticipated that an attempt would be made by the supporters of the rival claimant to the Spanish throne, Duke Philip of Anjou, to retake Gibraltar. In fact, there was more than one attempt. The first attempt was by sea, less than 3 weeks after Gibraltar was taken, and it happened in these waters. A French fleet sailed down the Mediterranean, and a British fleet sailed out of the bay round Europa Point, and the two fleets engaged in these waters on the 24th of August. The battle was indecisive. No ships were sunk on either side, and eventually the French fleet withdrew. The next attempt to take Gibraltar was by land. On the 3rd of September 1704, the Marquis of Villadarias, the Captain General of Andalusia, marched on Gibraltar at the head of an army of 4,000 men. It was Villadarias who had omitted to send reinforcements to Gibraltar when requested to do so by Diego de Salinas, the last Spanish governor of Gibraltar. A month later, in October 1704, a force of 3,000 men was landed at Algeciras. They were French, and they were under the command of Marshal Tessé. And the Frenchmen marched to the isthmus to join up with the Spanish army led by Villadarias. So there was now an army of 7,000 men ready to attack Gibraltar. Seeing the preparations on the Spanish side, Prince George of Hesse reinforced Gibraltar's defences at the northern end. In 1704, the sea used to come up to here, to the centre of what is today Winston Churchill Avenue. And between the sea and the cliff face, there was a small natural lake. And what Hesse did was to enlarge it and to deepen it and to create an inundation. And the purpose of doing so was to reduce the land space between the sea and the inundation to just a narrow causeway. So anybody approaching the defences of Gibraltar would have to walk along this causeway in full sight of the guns of Gibraltar. Hesse improved the defences in the area of the Round Tower, which was as far as the Spanish defences extended along the cliff face. And the Round Tower stood just here on this outcrop next to a natural cleft in the rock. Hesse also redesigned the glacis on which I'm standing. Now, a glacis is a slope, and behind the slope there is a ditch, and behind the ditch are the defense walls. So that meant that an attacker would have to overcome two obstacles. First of all, he'd have to come up the glacis, up the slope, and be in full sight of the defences on the walls and on the sides. And then if he'd overcome that and got into the ditch, he'd then find that there was a tall wall behind him. And in 1704, the walls were in fact taller than they are now, because Grand Battery had not yet been built. By the time that the attack by the Spaniards actually commenced, Hess had completely redesigned and reinforced the northern defences of Gibraltar. His aim was to make Gibraltar impregnable. But there was an enemy within. On the 19th of October 1704, a plot was discovered in Gibraltar. It involved passing information to the camp of the Marquis of Villadarias, the Captain General of Andalusia, who was the commander of the Spanish forces attacking Gibraltar. Involved in the plot were two colonels, Colonel Gonzalez and Colonel Huson, a captain, a friar from the convent of St. Francis, now the governor's residence, and a friar from the convent that stood here, a Mercedarian friar of the convent of La Merced. This is where the gate of Granada stood. It was cut into the walls, the castle batteries leading from the castle right down to Landport. And it led into Villavieja and out to the Round Tower. When the French bombardment began at the end of October 1704, it was the Round Tower that was targeted in particular, and this entrance to Gibraltar. I have come along the upper way through what we now call the northern defences to this point, which is where the Round Tower used to stand. It was on the outside of this arch. And when the French bombardment began at the end of October 1704, the tower was breached, but it was not taken. This is the North Bastion. To the Spaniards, it was El Baluarte de San Pablo, St. Paul's Bastion, and its guns commanded the isthmus on one side and the port on the other. And in the attack by the French in October 1704, this bastion took a bashing. In fact, it was breached. This is the exterior of the North Bastion. The oldest parts are made of tapia, as distinct from the white stone of British later additions. And you can see that it took a punishment, not only in this siege of 1704 and 1705, but in later sieges, and had to be repaired in many places. The French bombardment and attack therefore had a very strong impact on the northern defences of Gibraltar. Hess, on the 6th of August, he appointed the first governor of Gibraltar, Henry Nugent. He was an Irishman and had a Spanish title, Conde de Valdesoto, the Count of Valdesoto. And he was a brave soldier. He led from the front. And as a result, he was killed because of enemy action on the 9th of November, 1704. Henry Nugent was a Roman Catholic, and he was buried here in what we call the King's Chapel today, but was then the Church of St. Francis. And he was buried at night, because that was the time when the Spanish guns were silent. There are many memorial tablets that grace the walls of the King's Chapel. And they relate to persons who are not actually buried here, because they're buried elsewhere. The tablets are simply a commemoration of them. On the other hand, Nugent was buried in this church, and there's no memorial to him on the walls. Nugent's replacement as governor was Brigadier Shrimpton. He was the first British governor of Gibraltar, but because Gibraltar had been taken in the name of the Archduke Charles of Austria, Shrimpton was also given a commission in the army of the Archduke. This is the entrance to Campamento. You may wonder at the origin of the name. Well, this is where the commander of the French troops set up his camp, his Campamento. He was Marshal de Tessé, and the name Campamento, in fact, has lived on even to today. The Spanish army was under the command of the Captain General of Andalusia, the Marquis of Villadarias. And there was rivalry between Villadarias and Tessé. This came to the fore when a surprise attack on Gibraltar was suggested, because Villadarias supported it and Tessé did not. What their plan involved was an attack led by Colonel Figueroa and involving 500 men who were going to be led by a shepherd, Simon Susarte, along a path on the east side of Gibraltar. There is a plaque at the top of the rock that says that 500 men were led up a path here to the top of the rock, and that they were discovered and that the path was later scarped away and removed altogether. And actually, the plaque is wrong and it is misleading. It should be removed. Because if you look over the cliff, it's impossible to lead a whole group of 500 men up such an inaccessible cliff. From this angle, it can be appreciated just how steep the cliffs are in this particular area. Susarte led Colonel Figueroa and the attacking force along this side, along the eastern beach, and the eastern side, the Mediterranean side, because this way they could not be seen by the defenders in the garrison. Susarte led Colonel Figueroa and his men this way, past what we now call Catalan Bay. But in 1704, there was absolutely nothing here. There were no houses, nothing, because the place was used occasionally by Spanish fishermen who used to fish for anchovy when in season, but they used to live in caves at the back. Susarte then led Colonel Figueroa and his men along the path that led here above Sandy Bay. By then, it was the middle of the afternoon of the 10th of November, 1704. But they didn't stop here. They carried on just above sea level and continued southwards. The path led a short distance above the sea, here towards Gorham's Cave. At Gorham's Cave, there was a beach, and there was also an access point from that beach up to and leading towards Windmill Hill. And it was that way that Susarte led Colonel Figueroa and his men. Having left the beach at Gorham's Cave, the attackers then came up this way towards Windmill Hill. By the time they got up to Windmill Hill, it was close to evening. The attackers, we're told, did not want to spend the night out in the open, and so they came here to St. Michael's Cave. So Susarte, Figueroa and his men spent the night here. But of course, in those days, there were no lights in St. Michael's Cave, so it must have been awfully spooky. Figueroa was expecting reinforcements of 1,500 men to arrive the following morning. They did not. So he had a choice. He could either go back along the way that he'd come, or he could continue with his daring surprise attack. He chose to attack, and he led his men this way, towards the top of the rock. Figueroa and his men were spotted whilst he was still close to the top of the rock. The alarm was given in the garrison, and the element of surprise, which was so critical to the whole enterprise, had been lost. I suspect at that point some of the men thought that it was a lost cause, and they turned and went back the way they had come. It made sense to retreat, to fight another day. There was another critical tactical error in the plan. Because the French and Spanish army that was besieging Gibraltar was short of ammunition for the infantrymen, the soldiers who had accompanied Figueroa in this sally had only been given 3 rounds of ammunition each. They were on a suicide mission. The surprise attack coincided with the arrival in the bay of a fleet under Admiral Leake. He was bringing reinforcements to the garrison. Now, Figueroa must have seen the fleet arriving, and at this point, it would have been obvious that the garrison was going to be strengthened, and it was not an appropriate moment for an attack. But nevertheless, Figueroa persisted, and he continued with the attack. This is the marriage register of 1704, and in it, the parish priest, Father Juan Romero de Figueroa, who was no relation of Colonel Figueroa, wrote an eyewitness account of the assault on Gibraltar in November 1704. And he tells us that 200 Spaniards, rather than be captured and taken as prisoners of war, preferred to jump off the rock. And he tells us, no doubt, that there were others who would have been captured and taken as prisoners, but in the register of deaths, he records the names of 2 of those who died. And this is the entry. We have Don Melchor Seu, who was a native of Seville and a captain of the Spanish infantry, and also a plain soldier, Diego Lorenzo, soldado de los españoles, a Spanish soldier. These are harrowing, first-person accounts of what actually happened on that occasion. And we have here an account written by Father Juan Romero de Figueroa of what he observed on the 21st of November 1704. And he tells us that 1,566 shells were fired at Gibraltar from the isthmus. He also tells us that 1/3 of them fell into the sea or hit what he calls the mountain. We call it the rock. He also tells us that none of them got as far as the church of St. Mary the Crowned. So it gives us an idea of the range of the guns on the isthmus. After the reinforcements arrived, there were 2 attempts at a sally or an infantry attack on the Spanish positions. They took place on the 23rd of December and on the 31st of December, but they were inconclusive. Far more damage was done to both sides by disease. More soldiers died of sickness than from wounds inflicted by the enemy. And it impacted on both sides because both the defenders in Gibraltar and the attackers suffered many, many casualties from disease. But then it was something that was typical of the time. particularly as the soldiers did not have the immunity to disease that the people living in the area had developed over a long period of time. The last major attack by land of the siege was from the 3rd to the 7th of February 1705. The Round Tower was attacked, and also here, Hesse's demi-bastion. The bastion was built on top of the old Baluarte de San Pedro, the San Pedro bastion. In the meanwhile, an air of normality was beginning to return among the civilian population. And that can best be seen through this book here. This is the Register of Marriages of the Church of St. Mary the Crowned for 1704. And the very first wedding to take place in Gibraltar since it was captured on the 4th of August 1704 took place on the 9th of February 1705, 6 months after the capture. And the entry tells us that the bridegroom was Miguel Verde, and he married Ana Pomares de Moya. This occurred just after the last major attack on Gibraltar by the land forces on the isthmus. But of course, at the time, Miguel and Ana could not possibly have known that the siege was now drawing to a conclusion. Meanwhile, on the 26th of February 1705, a French fleet arrived in the bay. But the admiral was afraid they'd be captured, so all sailed away except for 5 ships. 2 were sunk, 2 were taken by the Dutch, and 1 by Admiral Leake. The capture and sinking of the 5 French ships marked the beginning of the end of the siege. By mid-April 1705, Marshal de Tessé began to withdraw the French troops. This left Villadarias in full and sole command. Meanwhile, by the beginning of May, on the 2nd of May, Villadarias started to withdraw the Spanish troops. The siege was over. There was only one thing left to do. Engineers were sent from Gibraltar onto the isthmus to destroy all the works done by the besieging armies. The isthmus now took on the same aspect it had before the siege. It was safe for cows to graze there once again. The end of the siege of late 1704 and early 1705 did not mean that Gibraltar was now British. Gibraltar had been taken by an Anglo-Dutch force in August 1704 in the name of Archduke Charles, the Austrian pretender to the Spanish throne. But the War of the Spanish Succession still rumbled on, and it was to be a further 8 years before the war finally came to an end when the Treaty of Utrecht was signed in 1713. Next time, we'll be looking more closely at the entirety of the Treaty of Utrecht and not just Article 10, under which Gibraltar became British.